Chapter 24. Getting Away. Reyes kept his distance from the elf, waiting for Gentine to make the first move. He watched every step the elf made, keeping his eyes on his opponent at all times. Gentine closed the gap between them, and their swords clashed. Reyes half expected Gentine to consider himself so superior in his skill that he would try to strike Reyes down in an instant, thus leaving himself wide open into the bargain. However, whatever the elf truly expected of Reyes' abilities, it seemed that he himself was too experienced to make such an elementary mistake. The elves all began to chant. They just repeated their leader's name again and again. Gentine, Gentine, Gentine. It was Gentine who drew first blood. He feinted a quick lunge at Reyes' midriff, and then sidestepped at the last moment, and before Reyes could move to block the elf's new angle of attack, Gentine's sword had clipped the edge of Ace's wing. It was a nasty gaze, but it could have been worse. A little bit further and harder, and Gentine might have cut off part of his wing. As it was, Reyes barely felt any pain. He had felt it though, and that filled him with hope that maybe one day he would be able to use his wings, and maybe even fly. "You should have gone for first blood," Reyes commented. "You would have won by now." If anything, Reyes was beginning to doubt his own ability. This elf was good. He was very good. Maybe it would have been better to just hand over the sword. Surely that would have been better than dying. It would be quite ironic in a way for Reyes to have escaped the hangman's noose, only to die before the hour of his original execution at the hands of an elf. At least this way, he felt his life would have had meaning. Gentine didn't reply. He just grunted his annoyance. He was annoyed, no doubt, that having finally struck his opponent, he hadn't done much damage. Fortunately for Reyes' peace of mind, it wasn't too long before he was able to even the score. While Gentine was occupied blocking Reyes' blade during one exchange, Reyes went in with the claws of his other hand. He ripped a hole in the elf's chainmail shirt, piercing the flesh beyond, just a little. As he pulled back his hand with part of the elf's armour, he saw a few pinpricks of blood oozing out of his opponent's chest. It was true, Reyes thought to himself. Harpy claws really can smash through armour. He couldn't help thinking that a mature harpy, one who was trained in the usage of claws, could probably have been able to end the fight right then. As it was, it had been a devastating blow on the elf's armour and on Reyes' hand. No one had ever warned him that it would hurt so much. Perhaps he hadn't gotten the angle right or something, but his whole hand felt like it was on fire. He even began to fear that he might have broken a bone. "You're good," Gentine grunted. He sounded as if he was out of breath. "Better than any other harpy I've ever had to fight." "Thank you," Reyes replied, though in truth all he had really heard was the first two words. He was certain that the heavy breathing was an act to get him to lower his guard. It was true that Reyes was also feeling very tired, but most of that tiredness was coming from his legs, and they had been tired since before he had found the bodies of the soldiers. Then as the two clashed again, Reyes made a clumsy mistake. Gentine took advantage of the blunder and ripped a deep gash through Reyes' chest. Reyes was able to twist away quickly, stopping the blow from becoming fatal, but he was bleeding badly. Reyes took a couple of steps back from Gentine and checked the gash on his chest. It looked very nasty. Reyes couldn't help but notice that harpy blood was red. It was something he would never have guessed. He had half expected it to be black, considering the colour of his skin. Gentine let Reyes take a quick breather while he readdressed his balance. But then he was back into the melee almost immediately, sword striking down hard and missing Reyes by mere inches. Reyes knew he had to finish the fight before his chest wound weakened him too much. He stumbled back, trying to make it look as if he was worse off than he actually was. Gentine took the bait. He came in and struck hard with his sword. Reyes blocked the elf's attack, and then slid his sword along the blade of his opponent until it was up plush with the hilt guard of that sword. Reyes had hoped that he'd be able to use his strength to cut through the hilt guard and onto the belly of the elf, but Gentine's sword was obviously made of stronger stuff. Gentine whipped his sword around in such a way that Reyes nearly lost his grip on his own sword. As it was, it left Reyes wide open to the elf's blade. Gentine came in hard and fast, aiming again for Reyes' midriff. Not seeing a way to stop the blow with his sword, Reyes tried to protect himself with his arm. Gentine's sword hit one of the silver bracelets Reyes was wearing. The blow had been stopped, and now it was Gentine's turn to be wide open. Reyes took full advantage of this sudden stroke of luck. He struck the elf quickly in the side of the chest, and then followed up with a second blow that cleaved the elf's head between the eyes. The fight was over. Reyes was tired, but victorious. He took a couple of steps back from the corpse, feeling horrified that he was responsible for the elf's death. He was shivering with the adrenaline rush and feeling greatly overcome by a sense of guilt. He knew he had to recover quickly. Harpies weren't supposed to be upset by the act of killing another. Trying to take his mind off what he had just done, Reyes checked the damage to the bracelet. The blow had been hard and heavy, and yet the bracelet wasn't even dented. There seemed to be a low murmuring among the remaining elves. Some of them seemed to be considering the idea of attacking him and gaining revenge for their leader, while at the same time claiming that sword for themselves. Others seemed to be trying to egg on those who were nearest to them to do the attacking. The little girl who sat by the fire renewed her crying. Reyes wiped his sword clean on the elf leader and returned it to its scabbard. He wanted to heal his wounds, but he daren't display use of magic in front of the elves when they might still be planning to attack him. He returned to where he had dropped his equipment and gathered each item slowly, acting as if he didn't have a fear in the world, whilst keeping a careful eye on what the elves were doing. One of those elves finally worked up enough courage to step forward and approach him. Reyes assumed he was probably the next highest ranking officer left. The elf walked forward, keeping his hands away from his weapons to make it clear to Reyes that he wasn't a threat. He spoke in Elvish. "Well done, Harpy. I'm afraid any agreement you had as to the children, though, you had with him. I cannot afford to return home without my prizes, not considering how many we lost to get them." Since Reyes had been acting as if he didn't understand a word of Helistran, he found it easy to ignore this new elf. As it was, he understood the gist of what the new leader was saying, but he pretended to be ignorant. "Thank you, yes, I'll take the meat now," Reyes replied graciously. The elf stood and looked blankly, not comprehending what Reyes had said. Reyes took a small dagger from Jensen's body, and then walked over to where the children were being kept. No," the elf said insistently. He also approached the children, trying to stop Reyes. Reyes turned round and showed the elf the dagger, looking as menacingly as he could when he did so. He then turned back to the children and cut the ropes tying the girl. He left one rope, the one around her neck. Though it would pain him to do so, he would have to lead her out of the camp by that rope, so as to avoid suspicion as to his true intent. "I can't let you take the children," the elf insisted. He tried to wrestle the dagger from Ace's hand. Reyes pushed the elf away and gave him a pointedly dirty look. He continued to act the disgruntled harpy who had no idea what this irritating elf was going on about. The elf didn't like that. From where he was on the ground, he began to draw his sword. Reyes acted quickly. Loath though he was to use magic here, he wanted to get away without any more bloodshed. "I think you should go to sleep." Reyes cast a spelling flourish before he even realized what language he was using. He then made the required gesture with his hand. The elf's head settled quietly back against the ground. There were some alarmed comments from the elves who were watching the display. It now seemed that none of them were too keen on the idea of trying to take him on. Reyes picked the baby up. He was wet. That wasn't too surprising. The baby was probably very scared and missing his mother. Reyes then took hold of the end of the rope that was still attached to the girl. He gave it a gentle tug and then spoke one word of flourish. "Come." Are you going to eat us, Mr. Harpy?" the girl asked in between sobs. By the very sound of her voice, Reyes could tell that she was terrified. "Come," Reyes repeated. He hated to do this, but he had to act heartless and callous in front of the elves. He jerked the rope forcibly and dragged her pitilessly over to where the noble horses were kept. His instinct told him to put the girl and the baby on one horse and ride another out of camp. He knew that wouldn't be a good idea, not with the elves watching. Instead, he handed the baby to the little girl and untethered the horses while keeping hold of the rope that was tied about her neck. You won't be able to move them," the little girl said between sobs. They're well trained. The elves had a lot of trouble getting them this far. That, thought Reyes to himself, was because the elves wouldn't know how to handle such horses, whereas I do. He gave the horses a gentle pull on the reins, and the horses, trained to understand what that meant, followed their new master without any hesitation. Reyes then pulled gently on the rope, trying not to hurt the girl any more than he had to, and together they left the elven encampment, heading generally towards the north. He had given the elvish horses little to no mind. The 3 noble horses would be plenty for his needs. Somehow he couldn't see himself herd 30 or so horses through the forest while he was trying to sneak across the border, assuming the elves even let him take them. They pushed on through the trees, a task made harder by the fact that there wasn't a lot of room for the horses, and further compounded by the girl struggling to get free, and his feet screaming at him for a break. It didn't help that at any moment he expected the elves to come out of their stupor and pursue him in search of the booty they had lost so many of their number trying to capture in the first place. Perhaps he should have taken their horses, if only to let them wander. They walked for about 10 minutes until Reyes felt he was far enough from the elf camp not to be seen. Then he stopped just long enough to seat the girl on one of the horses. By the look of it, she was also tired from travelling, so he eased the load by taking the baby back off her. The girl watched his every move, wide-eyed and terrified. She had stopped crying for the time being. It could simply be that she had nothing left to cry with. Reyes checked about himself. There was no sign of any elves, but then his eyesight was hardly the best during the hours of darkness, even when enhanced by a cat sight spell. What might be more pertinent was that he couldn't hear anything that might be of an elven nature. Satisfied that the coast was clear, he unsheathed his sword. The little girl cowered. "Please don't eat me, Mr. Harpy." She covered her eyes with her hands, dreading the expected blow. Reyes looked up at the little girl. He wanted to assure her that she was safe with him, but would she really believe him? The next thing Reyes did was check the blade of his sword for blood. He had only given it a quick wipe after the battle, and he didn't want any of that elven blood getting into his wounds. Once he was happy that the sword was relatively clean, Reyes placed the blade against the gash in his chest. Using the sword to channel magical energy into the wound, Reyes' chest was soon as good as new. When Reyes finished with the spell, he saw the little girl looking at him. She was wide-eyed and terrified again, but there was something else. Reyes decided to try and reach out to her. "My name is Reyes," he said to her. It seemed his lips could still find their way around flourish words. The spell Mangloss had cast on him still worked. Reyes hoped the effect was permanent. The girl didn't reply. She just looked at him with fear in her eyes. "I know your family name is Arliss," Reyes said. "I saw the coach. I'm sorry about your parents." "Are you going to eat us?" the girl asked. She was trembling. "I wasn't planning on it," Reyes said. "If I undo the rope, will you run away from me? I know what that elf told you, but I promise you that my only intent is to get you somewhere safe. If you run from me, you might end up running back into the hands of the elves." The girl seemed to calm down a little, as if all she had needed was Reyes' reassurance that he intended her no harm. "I won't run," she promised. Reyes somehow had the feeling that the girl would still run the first opportunity she got. On the other hand, maybe she would stay with him if he carried the baby. Slowly, and carefully so as not to hurt her, Reyes untied the last rope. Then, in order to add credence to his claim that he didn't plan to hurt them, he said, "The village of Tanton is around here somewhere. I'll take you there." "You really don't intend to eat us?" the girl asked, unsure. She didn't sound quite as scared as she had. "I really don't," Reyes informed her. It was the early hours of the morning. The village of Tanton was very quiet. Yet even at this time of night there was activity. A dog roaming the streets in search of tidbits, cats hunting mice, and militia on patrol. Right on the edge of the village was a small temple to the local deity. From the size of it, Reyes doubted that there could be more than one priest. He further assumed that the priest most likely lived in the small house just to the side of the temple. Who better to leave the children with? Reyes tied the horses to the nearby trees, telling the girl, "When I leave, I'll be taking one of these horses with me. The other two will be here for you in the morning." The girl nodded. She still looked very scared, but it did seem to be dawning on her that this harpy was trying to look out for her well-being. Come on, Reyes instructed. He then broke ground and headed straight towards that small building. Even with his weak, harpy legs, he could run faster than a 5-year-old girl. But he kept pace with her, not wanting to leave her behind. Getting into the house was simple enough. The same unlock spell that had gotten him out of those manacles earlier worked just as well on doors. He simply pointed at the lock and turned his finger suddenly. The lock opened with a satisfying click. Reyes pulled open the door and he stepped inside, feeling a great deal of relief that he was no longer outside in the open where someone from the militia might catch him. The little girl followed him in. Since it was the middle of the night, it made sense to Reyes to head towards the bedroom of the house. It was only a small building, all on one floor, and there was only the one bedroom. The priest was in bed, sound asleep and snoring his head off. Reyes used a little bit of magic to light the candle that the priest had sitting beside his bed. He then pulled a rickety-looking chair over and placed it next to the bed so that he could rest his feet for a minute. He had to sit on the chair sideways because, although he couldn't feel much from his tail, it was still big enough to get in the way. Before doing anything else, Reyes handed the baby to the little girl, who took him gladly. He then turned his full attention back to the priest. "Father," Reyes said gently, "Father, please wake up." For a moment the priest seemed to be awake, but then he began to snore again. "Father, please," Reyes insisted. This time he patted the priest's arm just a little. The priest opened his eyes slowly and drowsily. Then he caught sight of Reyes and screamed, sitting up in bed and cowering as far over to the other side as he could. It was only because the other side of the bed rested against the wall that the priest didn't fall out. "Father, please don't be alarmed. I'm not gonna hurt you," Reyes said quickly. If the smell was anything to go by, the priest was very alarmed and had, at the very least, wet himself. "Don't kill me." Reyes shivered. If the priest was much louder, the militia would come running. "Father, I need your help. Please calm down. I just rescued these 2 children from a band of elves. They need somewhere to stay until morning." The priest looked at Reyes skeptically. He then looked for and found the children Reyes had mentioned. When he spoke, he sounded a lot calmer. "Just them? You aren't seeking sanctuary or anything?" "Just them," Reyes confirmed. "Good," the priest commented. "I'm afraid it's not in my power to go against the king's ruling." "I know," Reyes replied. "I wouldn't want to put you in that position." "Okay," the priest agreed. There was a look on his face as if he couldn't believe he was having this conversation. "I think I can find room for them for the night." "Thank you, Father," Reyes said. "They are Duke Arliss's children." He paused for a second and then added, "Though I suppose one of them is actually now the current Duke. Arliss was attacked and killed on the road by elves. Could you send someone to the castle tomorrow and let them know what has transpired?" "I will," the priest replied, "although I may skip over your involvement. The Duke might not understand." Reyes smiled. "You'd get no trouble from the Duke, but the King might not be so forgiving, so you would be wise to avoid mentioning me." "Thank you, Reyes," the little girl said. "Reyes?" the priest commented. "Is that really your name? It seems a funny name for a harpy. You know, the Duke has a son called Reyes." "Indeed," Reyes replied. "Look, I'd better get going." "May the gods go with you," the priest replied. Leaving the priest's little house felt more dangerous than entering it. Reyes could see less of the village from the doorway than he could from the edge of the trees. On top of which, there was always the danger that the priest might decide to sound the alarm anyway. The priest didn't. Reyes made it back to where the horses had been stashed. It didn't take him long to decide which horse to take. The white ones were very pretty, but they were ceremonial horses used for pulling coaches. The black horse was a real war horse. Even heavily armoured as it was, it could gallop at quite a pace when called to. If Reyes was pursued all the way to the border, he was certain that the black horse would be his best chance of survival. There was another advantage to riding across the border. It meant he could finally take the pressure off his feet. When the border did eventually come into sight, the sun had already climbed above the horizon and was making its way gradually into the sky. Reyes wondered how much longer he would have had if he had stayed in that cell to await his fate. How long would he have before the king found him gone? For a moment he thought of his father. He hoped Prince Goatee was right and his father wouldn't be made to pay in his stead.